And so I just want to say that Graham is making a difference on the planet. The work that he is doing, the courage that he has, the heart, the humility. This is a walking master. Another round of applause, please.
Thank you. Feeling grateful for all the love, grateful to be amongst so many open-minded, free-thinking people. And thank you to Tim and Anne for organizing this fantastic event. These are two of the greatest people in the world. Thank you. Love you. Okay, can we turn these lights down? I want to start by thanking my wife, Santa, whose photograph we see there. I just have so many thank yous to say to Santa, but I'll start with the one that's right up front. We have been researching a huge new book on ancient America. And this year we've done 2 8-week road trips in America, driving, 12, 13,000 miles. Santa has had to do all the driving because I am banned from driving since my seizures. It's been a huge additional energy drain on Santa in addition to taking all the photographs, because Santa and I have made every journey together. We've climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times together. We've dived to the bottom of the deepest and strangest oceans and seen some amazing and wonderful things. The way things are with books and authorships, it ends up with a lot of the credit going to me, but really all the credit should go to my wife, Santa. I couldn't have done anything that I've done in the last 25 years if it hadn't been for this amazing woman by my side. This photograph, this portrait of Santa was painted by our friend David Uhl and gifted to me for my birthday. I'm showing it here to give Santa another thank you, which is our 6 children. We have 6 children together, have been from 3 broken marriages, have been brought together into a wonderful family of loving siblings by this amazing woman. I could not have done it. So I want to give credit where credit is due. Thank you, Santa. Okay, can we turn these lights down? The last glacial maximum, the peak of the last ice age, was 21,300 years ago. Ice caps more than 3 kilometers deep covered North America and Northern Europe. Sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today because all that water was locked up in those ice caps on top of North America and Northern Europe, and the sea was 400 feet lower, and there were freezing temperatures beyond anything that we can imagine today. It was a very hostile environment. But the Ice Age ended abruptly 11,600 years ago, and that ending was preceded by some interesting events. Now, this is the typical mainstream view about how the Americas got peopled. I will tell you right now that that mainstream view is rubbish, and it has been completely overthrown in the last few years. But for 50 years, it held a grip on the archaeological imagination that was like a stranglehold. The notion was that this ice-free corridor opened up between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets about 13,500 years ago. And across the Bering Straits, which were then a land bridge, came the so-called First Peoples of America. And archaeology very quickly identified them with a culture that they called the Clovis Culture. It's called the Clovis Culture because the type site is at Blackwater Draw near Clovis, New Mexico. For the best part of more than 50 years, actually, the model that archaeologists held was that there were no human beings in the Americas before 13,000 years ago. And these Clovis people who made these fantastic, really beautiful spear points and arrowheads, they came storming across the Bering Straits. They entered down into North America, and they massacred all the megafauna. I do not know of a single hunter-gatherer people anywhere on Earth that massacres megafauna. Hunter-gatherers live in harmony and cooperation with the animals they hunt. They do not wipe them out. When archaeologists spread this ideology, they were imposing ourselves on the past. We are the murderous, greedy, hungry culture that takes and destroys, not the Native Americans. And what has been said about the Clovis people was totally wrong. So, known as Clovis first, was a predominant hypothesis amongst archaeologists in the latter half of the 20th century, and that the Clovis people were the first habitants of the Americas. And the primary support for this idea was that there, for a long time, was no solid evidence of pre-Clovis human habitation in America. But as we're now seeing, more and more papers are coming out revealing new DNA evidence and new archaeological evidence. And although there are still some people clinging on to the Clovis first paradigm, they are hanging on by the skin of their teeth because the evidence is overwhelming the old paradigm. We are facing a paradigm shift. Here's Nature magazine admitting that this is the case, that actually archaeology has got the whole story of the Americas wrong in the model that it has taken over the last 50 years. And that people have been coming to the Americas for thousands and thousands of years before the Clovis culture was here. A case in point is Jacques Cinq-Mars, who was an archaeologist who excavated up in the Yukon in Canada. And what he found was evidence of human presence in the Yukon 24,000 years ago. Now, what he found was facts, but those facts contradicted the prevailing theory. So guess what archaeology did? They kept the theory and they threw out the facts. Jacques Cinq-Mars was humiliated, vilified, his research funding was withdrawn, he was giving no backup, his colleagues would turn their backs on him in the corridors. He was made an outcast and a pariah. I'm going to have to go a little bit closer to this because my eyesight is not that great, but I just want to read you a little bit from here. The result was always the same. When Jack proposed that Bluefish Caves, that's the site in the Yukon, was 24,000, it was not accepted. Funding for his bluefish work grew scarce. His field work eventually sputtered and died. And stung as he was by the criticism, Cinq-Mars refused to back down. None of the explanations for splintered bones could account for the complex chain of steps that produced the mammoth bone flake his team found. At one presentation he gave, they laughed at me, he says angrily today. They found me cute. Embittered by the response, he stopped attending conferences and gave up defending the site publicly. What was the point? To Cinq-Mars, the Clovis first supporters seemed almost brainwashed. But now, as the Smithsonian admits today, decades later, the Clovis first model has collapsed. Based on dozens of new studies, we know that pre-Clovis people slaughtered mastodons in Washington state, dined on desert parsley in Oregon, made all-purpose stone tools in Texas, slept in sprawling hide covers holes in Chile, all between 13,800 and 15,500. And now we have the follow-up study proving that Jacques Cinq-Mars was right and that there were humans in the Yukon 24,000 years ago. That is the follow-up study in PLOS One, which concerns the human presence. But the story is only just beginning. Here is Al Goodyear. I've just been with Al Goodyear in the Carolinas, and he discovered a site called Topper. Initially, he was looking for Clovis culture, but then he started to dig deeper, and he found that contrary to the prevailing theory, the evidence went deeper and deeper and deeper, and in archaeology, deeper is older. And what he eventually came up with was a site that was 50,000 years old, at Topper in South Carolina. And there I am just last week with Al Goodyear discussing his findings at Topper. And this is the Topper site. And you can see there's the Clovis level. But Al was finding evidence of human presence down here in the Pleistocene terrace. which is up to 50,000 years old. A real game changer. And then, breaking news, 26th of April, 2017, the Cerruti Mastodon site in San Diego. Evidence of human presence in the Americas 130,000 years ago. 10 times as old as that bloody Clovis first model, which locked up archaeology in a chain of its own making for so long. So we went to San Diego and we met Tom Demaray, the lead excavator, and he showed us his evidence. And you know what? Although his paper was published in Nature, he is facing now the same kind of savage attacks that others who earlier proposed an earlier human presence faced. It's as though there's some kind of negative force at work in archaeology that wants to pretend that Native Americans were recent comers to these lands, that wants to deny them the age-old presence on these lands that is truly and rightfully theirs. And they often say to Tom Demaray, but we haven't found any other site that's 130,000 years old. And he says, it's very simple, guys. You haven't looked. You just haven't looked. This is Denisova Cave in Siberia. Santa and I were there at the end of September, just before we began this research trip in America. It's called Denisova Cave because a monk called Denis used to meditate in there in the 19th century. But before Denis, there were lots of interesting things going on in Denisova Cave. As a matter of fact, 3 different species of human beings lived there. Anatomically modern humans like us, Neanderthals, we've all heard of them, and we all know that Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans interbred. And many of us in this room will have up to 3 or 4% of Neanderthal DNA in our genome. But what wasn't known until Denisova Cave was found was that another human species also existed. They call them the Denisovans. And these Denisovans also interbred with anatomically modern humans. And the date of the Denisovan occupation lair in Denisova Cave is about 75,000 years ago. And I'm just looking into the entrance to the cave here. And this is the inside of the cave with a natural smoke hole up there. And I'm looking down into the excavation gallery. As you can see, modern human beings can't resist leaving their horrible graffiti all over some of the most precious archaeological sites on Earth. Most unfortunate. Found in that Denisovan lair, 75,000 years old, was this bracelet. This beautiful greenstone bracelet, which changes color depending on the light that is cast upon it. It is undoubtedly intact and not intrusive to the Denisovan lair. It doesn't make any sense there. Our ancestors 75,000 years ago, let alone ancestors who weren't even anatomically modern, are not supposed to have been making stuff like this. They're not supposed to have been drilling holes in it with high-speed drills that leave a very distinct drill mark. They treasured this. It was repaired, fixed with a kind of glue that has still not been understood, and they made these beautiful bone needles. That one's exactly like a modern steel needle. Nobody knows what they were making those needles for, but it kind of follows that they were stitching stuff together. And one suggestion is that they were stitching together skins to make boats. Oh, this is the couple that we stayed with in the village of Topolnoye. To get to Topolnoye, which is 13 kilometers from Denisova Cave, to get to Topolnoye, here's what you do. You fly to Moscow, then you take another flight to Novosibirsk. Then you drive 18 hours south until you get to Topolnoye, where you find yourself amongst the real people. Beautiful people, so friendly, so warm, so welcoming. So, you know, if anybody wants to go see Denisova Cave, drop me a line. I'll connect you with these guys. They've got a couple of spare rooms. And it's the first time I've ever drunk milk straight out of the cow. Well, here's the thing about Denisova Cave. You see, there it is, down in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, near to Mongolia and Kazakhstan. Okay, and Over here is the far eastern extension of Siberia, and then you get the Bering Straits, and then you get Alaska and America. The interesting thing about the Denisovans is that today, their DNA has not survived in the region of Denisova Cave, but it has survived in two other regions. As the Daily Mail rather fancifully pointed out, were Aborigines the first Americans? That's not quite the case. But what is the case is that the strongest signals of Denisovan DNA today are found amongst Aboriginal Australians and amongst certain tribes of South American Indians living in the Amazon. They are not found in North America. What does that tell us? It tells us that Denisovan DNA got to South America by sea. There's no other way that it got there. And the puzzles keep on turning. There's other DNA evidences showing West Eurasian origins amongst Native Americans, with so much new genetic and archaeological evidence coming to light year by year, overturning old certainties about the peopling and prehistory of the Americas. Maybe it's time to reconsider some other supposed certainties as well. Greg was just showing us his amazing work on the mound building culture, and I won't spend long on that culture, but this is Monk's Mound, Madison County, Illinois, and it's the largest pyramid in the Americas north of Mesoamerica. It's believed by mainstream archaeology to be no more than 1,100 years old. And here is Serpent Mound in Ohio. From the little viewing platform, you can't really make it out properly. You need to get 400 feet above it in order to see what it really looks like. So we bought a drone, and Santa learned to fly the drone. And this is what you get. You get of course, it's all overgrown with trees today. In ancient times, it was not. But you get the body of the serpent, and there's the head of the open mouth of the serpent with a kind of oval disc in it. But you really realize what's happening when you go there on the eve of the summer solstice, the 20th of June, 20th, 21st of June. There's the serpent. There's the head of the serpent. There's the open mouth of the serpent. And that open mouth of the serpent is targeting the setting sun, where it sets through a notch in the distant hills at sunset on the summer solstice. A huge effort was put in to make this alignment, this connection, this marriage of heaven and earth that took place at Serpent Mound. Back to Siberia for a moment. Curious rock forms were found, which local archaeologists believe are man-made, and they call them the dragon and the griffin, and they believe they date back 12,000 years to the end of the Ice Age or earlier. So naturally, when we were down at Denisova Cave, we went and had a look at these rather extraordinary things, and I'm standing on top of the griffin here. So that's its beak, and this rather regular cut structure, which certainly does look man-made to me. I think the object is largely natural, but I think it was recognized by human beings, and I think it was slightly adjusted and shaped. Just down the hill is the one they call the dragon or a serpent, which seems to have an eye and the nose and mouth of a serpent. Again, I'm not claiming that this is a man-made artifact. I'm claiming that there were ancient cultures to whom nature spoke, to whom Mother Earth spoke. And when Mother Earth spoke with a natural alignment, because this one also lines up to the summer solstice sunset, they were made special. Interestingly enough, at Serpent Mound, sorry, it's difficult with this small screen to really show you, but there's the eye and there's the nose and mouth of a serpent in the rock at Serpent Mound. And one could easily say, oh, that's just a coincidence. There's nothing really there to look at, except for the fact that right on top of that natural serpent's head is where all this is happening. And that, to me, rules out coincidence. Some ancient people saw a rock outcrop that looked a bit like a serpent and that pointed naturally towards the setting sun on the summer solstice, and they created this huge complex around it. Serpent Mound is thought to be about 2,500, 2,300 years old. But what about Watson Break, which is at least 5,500 years old, and the intriguing findings of archaeoastronomer William F. Romaine? You can't get into Watson Break, but William Romaine was able to do this mapping, and it's an artist's impression of what Watson Break would have looked like. And sure enough, there's a summer solstice sunset alignment there as well. What does this tell us? This tells us that the central concerns of the cultures that were still building mounds 1,000 years ago were present 5,500 years ago. You know, the Squire and Davis survey that Greg Little referred to speaks of tens of thousands of mounds. 90% of them have all gone, thanks to the predation of our culture. They've been replaced with malls and restaurants. 90% of them have gone. How far back does this culture really go? We know it goes back at least 5,500 years. Maybe it goes back much further than that. Maybe we should keep our minds open that what the archaeologists are looking at are just the latest incarnations of much older sites that were constantly remade and redeveloped by the living cultures that lived amongst them. It's why you can't really find any ancient temple in India, because the Hindu religion is still alive. Go to Egypt, you'll find temples that are 4,000 years old. But go to India, you will not. That's not because the Indian religion is younger. It's an ancient religion, vastly ancient. But it's because it's a living culture and because they keep rebuilding and redeveloping monuments. I suggest the same thing happened in the Americas. One of the wonderful things about America is the way that citizens groups will just take things into their own hands, stop listening to what the experts are preaching at them, and get out there and look for themselves. This is called Turtle Rock. It's in upstate New York, and it's certainly a natural landform. It has the shell of a turtle and the open mouth of a snapping turtle. But the group of people who took us up there, Glenn Kreisberg and others, have done serious work on this, and they found that this also has a summer solstice sunset alignment. In other words, let us not, just because something is natural, let us not assume that it had no significance or no importance to the cultures that came before us. Just because we make stuff, just because we're all about tech, doesn't mean that all ancient civilizations were the same way we are. And these are certainly man-made. You know what these are called in upstate New York and New England in general? They call them colonial root cellars. What they say is that those colonists, you know, they needed to store roots. So they built these megalithic chambers. Let's go inside this chamber. Look at the megaliths on the ceiling there. It also targets the summer solstice sunrise. Do you need to target the summer solstice sunrise for a colonial root cellar built in 1750? Or is it possible that the colonists reused much older structures that were already existing? There's just hundreds of these things all over upstate New York. Giant. If we saw this in Ireland or in England, we would immediately say a megalithic passage grave. Same in Japan. But because it's here in America, and because of the prevailing racist ideology that the Native Americans were not capable of doing anything great, all their achievements got taken away. And everything great that they did was a huge attempt was just made to rubbish it. Another example, not so impressive from the outside, but get inside and again, you're looking at a giant megalithic structure. I think all of these mysteries urgently deserve to be readdressed. So now we're in Costa Rica, which is, of course, famous for its balls. And this is the biggest of Costa Rica's balls. This is El Silencio, which weighs 26 tons. Many of these stone spheres are almost perfectly spherical. And really, their variation from precise spheres is absolutely tiny. Some of them have carvings and engravings on them. They're incredible pieces of work. And the general view of archaeology is that this culture flourished between 600 AD and 1530 AD. In other words, it's another one of those recent cultures. But I don't understand how archaeology can possibly claim to know that. You cannot directly date a stone monument. You have to date it from the context in which it is found. And in Costa Rica, almost every one of these stone spheres has been moved away from its original settings. People use them as garden ornaments. They stick them in front of hotels. They're all over the place. We don't have the context anymore. And where we do have the original context, it's dynamic, flooded, constantly bringing in new sediment. To date these megaliths by context, by organic material found in the context, is just to date the context. It's not to date the megalith at all. We don't know, really and truly, we do not know how old these stone spheres are. Then we go to Ollantaytambo in the Peruvian Andes. Archaeology gives all of the great work of the Sacred Valley to the Incas, a relatively recent culture dating from about 1300 AD until the time of the Spanish conquest. But I believe the story is much more complicated than that. Let's look at this incredible stonework. These fine joints between these blocks of stone are supposed to have been made by people working with other stones, hammer stones. And they created jointing that is so precise that you can't even get a sheet of paper into the gap between them. It's not a satisfactory explanation in my view. And nor is the notion that the Incas did everything. This is a street in Cuzco. Are we seriously to believe that the culture who made this also made this? Because that's what the archaeologists say. They say that all of this is the work of one culture. I would say that what we're looking at is the work of many cultures, cultures that have come along and overbuilt and built around earlier work. Certainly on Lake Titicaca on the island of the Moon, this is an Inca structure. It was a structure that they were very proud of. It's where the Palace of the Virgins was, who would marry the Inca. It should have been their best work, but it doesn't compare at all with the incredible megalithic stonework of the Sacred Valley. I think we have to consider the possibility that the Incas did not build everything in the Sacred Valley. Did the culture that made this also make this? I don't think so. Did the culture that made this and this also make this? No. And then the fantastic walls of Sacsayhuaman up at Cuzco. School kids are taken on trips there. They're taught the Incas made everything. But did the Incas really make everything? There is not a record of the Incas ever successfully moving a stone of this size. That's what happens when we try and move stones of this size today. 300-ton blocks. But then to put them together into a massive three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle like this, look at the way that everything is fitted together, and try and find a single account of the Incas doing that. There is an account, actually, of them trying to bring a big stone to Sacsayhuaman. 3,000 people were killed on the journey, and eventually they gave up. And look at the indentations in the stone. He's curious, as though somebody's kind of stuck a thumb into the stone or scraped a butter knife down it, leaving the suggestion that the stone might have been softened in some way. And all around Sacsayhuaman, if you just look, you can see that the hillsides have been sculpted and shaped into these weird, bizarre stairways. And again, archaeology has just given everything to the Incas and not considered the possibility that the Incas came upon a much older megalithic site, which they venerated and overbuilt and built around, but were not responsible for the original creation of. Sculpted rocks like this. And here I am with Jesus Gamarra. Now, Jesus Gamarra, if anybody goes to the Sacred Valley, seek out Jesus Gamarra in Cuzco. His father, Alfredo Gamarra, before him, was a deep researcher of the mysteries of the megaliths of the Sacred Valley. Jesus himself is now nearly 80 years old. Boy, he's fit. He's like a mountain goat. I mean, he just runs around those hills, without any shortage of breath. Between him and his father, they've been studying the megaliths for more than 100 years. They are descendants of the Incas. If anybody should be proud of Inca achievement, it is them, but they absolutely deny that the Incas built everything. They say the Incas found most of this stuff and venerated it and respected it, but that they did not make it. And there are just so many strange anomalies to be found there, some of which remind me of the subterranean chamber in the Great Pyramid, which I'll come to in a moment. This is Pisac. Different styles of architecture, a huge megalithic rock in the center here, surrounded by work, I believe, of different periods. And again, I'm with Jesus, and he's pointing out the earlier work and the later work. If we go over to Bolivia, to Tiwanaku, we will find more gigantic stones. This is in the Pumapunku in Tiwanaku in Bolivia. And that'll give you a sense of the scale of the stonework here. And behind me are these curious H-shaped blocks. You can see a group of them there. They almost look to me like they were the ends of something, that something ran between two of these things and connected them, and that something is missing now. Just giant blocks of stone. Remember, we're 14,000 feet above sea level here. Looking down now on Tiwanaku, this is the so-called Akapana Pyramid, and this is the Kalasa Sia, the large rectangular structure that dominates Tiwanaku. If you look closely at the Kalasa Sia, you can see that it's got a row of megaliths running all the way around it. And in fact, if you look closer again, you can see those megaliths. Get closer. There they are. They're in the wall. You know what that wall is? That wall is an archaeological fantasy. That wall is what archaeologists think Tiwanaku should have looked like. But what was originally there was these huge standing stones, which compare with any of the great stones of Stonehenge or Avebury in the UK. Back here is the so-called Gateway of the Sun. And the Gateway of the Sun still plays with the sun at the solstices. But there is a curious phenomenon. The tilt of the Earth's axis changes very slowly over a long cycle. And with modern astronomy programs, we can model those changes, and they alter the rising point of the sun on the summer solstice. And you get the perfect alignment at Tiwanaku, not 2,000 years ago, as archaeologists would wish, but more than 12,000 years ago, suggesting that indeed that the origins of this site may be much more ancient. So could there have been some radical interruption in the story of the Americas that would help us towards a better understanding of anomalies like these? I'm going to tell you a little bit about J. Harlan Bretz, because he is a hero of mine. J. Harlan Bretz was a geologist who has recently been vindicated in his findings. This is National Geographic publishing a piece recognizing at last the incredible achievements of J. Harlan Bretz. He was a school science teacher initially, but he was intrigued by these features of the Columbia Plateau, these giant potholes and many other bizarre features. And this mystery inspired him to train as a geologist at the University of Chicago. He was awarded his PhD, and then he continued his studies in the channeled scablands of Washington State. He returned to northeastern Washington to mount a full-scale investigation. And he walked the walk for years and years and years. He did the real legwork that so many scientists today fail to do. And the conclusion he came to, looking at all the features of the channeled scablands, was this: that the only possible explanation for all the region's features was a massive flood, perhaps the largest in Earth's history. Quote, a debacle which swept the Columbia Plateau, ripping soil and rock from the landscape, carving canyons and cataracts in a matter of days. All other hypotheses meet fatal objections, he wrote in a 1923 paper. My goodness, by saying that, he got himself into a lot of trouble. As the National Geographic says, it was a geological heresy. You see, up until that time, and indeed still today, geologists were wedded to the notion of gradualism, that we can explain everything in terms of long, slow processes operating in the Earth. Geologists do not like cataclysms, especially if the cataclysms sound like the flood of Noah. That is a return to superstition in their view, and that's what they thought Bretz was doing. He was running geology back into superstition, and they almost killed him for that. The attacks that this man suffered, the vile insults that he had to put up with. During the 1920s, Bretz gave several lectures in which he expanded on his claim that all the damage across the Channel Scablands had resulted from a single gigantic flood that rose and fell within 3 months. The geologists were aghast in the same way that a room full of physicists would be upon hearing a colleague explain how he had made a perpetual motion machine out of old popsicle sticks. Physicists had all learned very early of the futility of perpetual motion machines, and no properly educated geologist was supposed to traffic in catastrophes of any sort. And he particularly alarmed and outraged the pedestrian minds of the profoundly conservative US Geological Survey, who were committed to the gradualist doctrine. And on the 12th of January 1927, Bretz was ambushed by a virtual lynch mob of hostile gradualists during a lecture he'd been invited to give at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. O.E. Meinsner, James Gillooly described Bretz's theory as preposterous, incompetent, wholly inadequate. And these critiques marked the relegation of Bretz to the status of a pariah amongst geologists and made him an outcast from the politer precincts of society. But you know what? The thing was, Bretz was right. And no matter how strongly those other geologists held on to their theory and sought to dismiss the facts, those awkward facts kept coming back, and they kept forcing that theory to be reconsidered. By the 1950s, they began to recognize that it had been right to claim that all the damage to the Channel Scablands has been caused by cataclysmic flooding. And plaudits began to come his way. And in 1965, the International Union of Quaternary Research organized an extensive field trip to review his evidence. And that trip traversed the full length of Grand Coulee, part of the Quincy Basin, much of the Palouse-Snake-Scabland Divide. Afterwards, participants sent Bretz a telegram acknowledging his early insights and claiming, quote, "We are all catastrophists now." Bretz received the telegram at the age of 83 and replied, "Be assured, but after 30 years and 30 papers in self-defense and more than 30 people who vigorously denied my theory, it did my heart good like medicine." It was the toxic antipathy of the gradualists of the Geological Society of America that originally made a pariah and a social outcast of Bretz. But in 1979, the GSA finally reversed its position and bestowed upon him the Penrose Medal, the most prestigious award in the field of geology. It honors outstanding original contributions or achievements that mark a major advance in science. Bretz was 96 years old at the time, and on receiving the award, he reportedly told his son, "All my enemies are dead, so I have no one to gloat over." Well, the gloating was perhaps a little bit premature, because what the gradualists did was, they took Bretz's evidence, which undoubtedly is evidence of massive flooding, but they subtly, cleverly tried to turn it into lots of small floods, rather than one big flood, which Bretz had always felt it was. You see, the problem with Bretz's theory was he could not come up with a source of water that could have caused all this flooding in one episode. He just couldn't come up with it. And actually, when he was told, you have to come up with a source of water, he said, "That's not my problem. I am telling you that this is evidence of flooding." But they wanted a source of water, and finally they happened upon a conclusion that was acceptable to the gradualists. And that conclusion was that the source of the flooding had been a glacial Lake Missoula. That it had burst its banks and it had flooded here, and that this had happened not once. Initially, Bretz was prepared to accept 4, then at this stage, the man's in his 90s. He wants to just go to his grave vindicated. He said, "Okay, if you insist, there were 4 floods, maybe even 8. Now the geologists are saying there were 80 floods. And if you watch on Nova, there's recently been a program, they will tell you that this is what caused the damage in the Channel Scablands, 80 floods out of Glacial Lake Missoula. basalt and granitic boulders now littering the Ephrata fan were carried there by torrents of water that gushed out of Grand Coulee. The largest piece of rock is more than 25 feet tall. Here is the Palouse Fall. It's what you call an underfit channel. That's the little waterfall that runs through it today. That's the fossilized waterfall that came down during the Ice Age. And this is Dry Falls. This is a multi-lobed fossilized waterfall. Starts over here, goes all the way around here, goes all the way around here. And it's one of the features that has always been difficult to account for by the multiple floods from Lake Missoula model. There I am with Randall Carlson at the foot of one of the lobes of Dry Falls. And there are Randall and I together on the left-hand side of Dry Falls. And we're looking again at a couple of the lobes of Dry Falls, which continues all the way down here and all the way down here as well. And to give you a sense of the scale, that's Niagara Falls put into the picture. Niagara Falls is the work of 12,000 years of the river. But the Dry Falls, according to Bretz's calculations, were created in less than 3 weeks by a huge flood, not just of water, a giant flood coming down off the ice cap, a giant flood in which massive icebergs jostled, a giant flood that had ripped up whole forests by its roots, that had enchained boulders and that were rolling and rumbling, a highly erosive flood. And as it poured down, it cut back the land and then it just suddenly stopped. If the flood had gone on, this fossilized waterfall might be 50 miles further north. But it just stopped. It stopped dead. And you cannot explain this with the multiple floods model. I think we're all familiar with current ripples on a beach. You know, when the tide goes out, leaves these nice little ripples about 1 inch high and a couple of feet long. But what about the current ripples in Camas Prairie? What about these current ripples? Put a car in there. These current ripples are 50 feet high and 300 feet long. Imagine the forces that could have created such a phenomenon. Nature is fractal. It's the same phenomenon that we see on a beach, but it's caused by humongous, massive forces of water pouring across it. And then the so-called glacial erratics. Yes, they are glacial erratics. These are chunks of rock that were carried, but they were not carried exactly on glaciers. This one, by the way, weighs 18,000 tons, and it stands 500 feet above the valley floor of the town of Wenatchee in Washington State. I'm there with Randall Carlson in front of it. That's me on top of it. How did this 18,000-ton chunk of rock get there? Because it comes from about 100 miles further north. The answer is that it got there in an iceberg the size of an oil tanker. And when that iceberg, carried by the floodwaters, grounded against the side of the Wenatchee Valley, it stuck there. And the floodwaters continued and receded, and they left the iceberg there, and the iceberg melted away, and this enormous chunk of rock found inside it is now exposed and sits there to this day. And it's not alone. There are thousands of giant rocks like this, all carried on icebergs during the flooding that occurred 12,860 years ago. This one's even called Boulder Park. There's so many of these huge glacial erratics. Not carried there by slow-moving glaciers, but carried there in icebergs that resulted from a breakup of the glaciers. While reluctantly accommodating the possibility of 7 or 8 Missoula floods within his model, Bretz never entirely abandoned his original idea that what the evidence on the ground bore testimony to was a single, massive, short-lived flood. Quote, "The unique assemblage of forms described as the channeled scabland records a unique episode in Pleistocene history. Special causes seem clearly indicated." Since 2007, a compelling and thoroughly documented case has been made by a group of more than 60 eminent scientists that the North American ice cap was hit 12,800 years ago by several large fragments of a disintegrating comet. And I can tell you now, if Bretz could have seen the evidence behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, I believe he would have abandoned glacial Lake Missoula and returned to the original conclusion of his field research, that there had been a single gigantic flood. The comet provides the hitherto missing heat source to account for the sudden melting of a sufficiently vast area of the ice cap. Let's just spend a word or two on comets and asteroids and cosmic impacts in general. I think everybody in the room knows that the dinosaurs were made extinct by a cosmic impact. Generally said to be an asteroid, although latest evidence is suggesting more strongly that it's a comet. And they keep on renaming it. Right now it's called the Cretaceous Paleogene event, but typically it's known as the Cretaceous Tertiary event, the KT event. It happened 65 to 66 million years ago, and it was a world-changing event. It left a distinct layer in the soil, a sooty, ashy layer, because when these objects come in hot and fast from outer space, superheated ejecta is thrown up into the upper atmosphere and it falls down, and any forests that are in the way are just going to burn. And you get huge biomass burning, and this leaves a layer in the soil. And other things are found in that layer: nanodiamonds, carbon spherules, melt glass, which is very like the trinitite that we find in nuclear explosions. They're called impact proxies. The father-son team who initially proposed that the dinosaurs were made extinct by a cosmic impact were Lewis and Walter Alvarez. Initially, all they had was the impact proxies in that layer of soil in the earth. For them, it was enough. Nothing else could have caused those carbon spherules, those nanodiamonds, that melt glass, that iridium, that platinum, in such abundance, except a cosmic impact. But the scholarly community would not believe them. And for 10 years, they were ridiculed for suggesting that a cataclysm had wiped out the dinosaurs, until they found the crater. And the crater is deeply buried beneath the Yucatan and the Gulf of Mexico. And after the crater was found, the objections died away, and we all accept that this world-changing event occurred, and that it was caused either by an asteroid or a comet. This paper is arguing in favor of a comet. Whether it was a comet or asteroid, the outcome was the same. The world was changed utterly. I mean, it was so utterly changed that it turned dinosaurs into chickens. Because that's it. That's what's left of the dinosaurs today, the bird line. You know, they're what's left of the dinosaurs. The world changed so much that the dinosaurs went away and we're left with chickens. At the same time, 65 million years ago, skulking around in the undergrowth was this little shrew-like mammal. The mammals were going nowhere on an Earth ruled by dinosaurs. But with the dinosaurs out of the way, they rapidly began to evolve. And so, 65 million years later, meet your 65 million year old mother. We are here because of that earth-changing event. If the dinosaurs had not been made extinct, mammals would not have risen to the top of the food chain, and human beings would not be ruling the earth, and that might be a very good thing. NASA wants us all to be very calm. No panic, please. NASA tells us that impacts on that scale only happen once every 100 million years. How nice of the universe to be so Germanic in its timekeeping that we can actually set our clocks by it. We got 35 million years left, guys. Nothing to worry about. Let's get on with raping the earth even more. Let's get on with pillaging this beautiful garden that's been given to us. No interruption to business and profits. But if NASA's right, of course, such events can't have had much of an influence on the much shorter time frame of human history. Since the 1980s, however, a number of eminent astronomers have warned that our cosmic environment may be much more active than NASA believes. You know, it's just a fact that you find traditions and myths of comets all over the world, and nowhere in any culture, anywhere in the world, in any period of history, was the appearance of a comet in the sky regarded as good news. It was always regarded as bad news. But not to NASA. They don't want us to worry. They're telling us what a meteor shower is. We pass through lots of meteor showers. We've just been through the Torrids, the Leonids, the Orionids, the Perseids. Every single meteor shower that you see is the remnant of a disintegrated comet. Every single one. Comets have a habit of breaking up into smaller and smaller pieces. Some of those pieces may be dust size, some of them may be boulder size, some may be house size, some may be country size, but they break up into pieces. So basically what NASA's saying is, yes, meteor showers are the remnants of former comets, but what falls out of them are usually small, from dust particle to boulder size, almost always small enough to burn up quickly in the atmosphere. Little chance that any of them will strike the Earth's surface, but there's a good chance that you can see a beautiful shooting star show in the middle of the night. How reassuring. Well, I guess quite a few of us in this room were around in 1994 and witnessed NASA's own imagery of Shoemaker-Levy 9, Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 hitting Jupiter. Comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 broke up into more than 20 glowing fragments. And those 20 glowing fragments were drawn down into Jupiter. The total explosive power of those impacts was 300 gigatons. A gigaton is equivalent to 1 billion tons of TNT. The stockpiled nuclear arsenal of the entire Earth, if it were to explode at once, would be equivalent to just 6.4 gigatons. Some of those impacts on the surface of Jupiter were larger than the Earth itself, and they were all caused by the fragments of a not very large comet. So this is the moment, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, this is the moment to say, thank you, Jupiter. Thank you for being the giant guardian of our planet. Thank you for your massive gravity. Thank you for circling in the outer solar system and sweeping up most of the comets that could have sterilized life on Earth hundreds of millions of years ago. Nevertheless, every now and then, a comet does get through. And here's Professor Bill Napier, who's the professor of astrobiology at Cardiff University. What he's saying in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society is the evidence, decades old now and not even controversial amongst the comet community, is that an exceptionally large, low inclination, short period comet has been orbiting in our neighborhood for about 20,000 years. In such a disintegrating environment, there's a reasonable probability of a catastrophic encounter with debris in the comet tail. And Napier and his colleagues believe that such catastrophic encounters have occurred several times in the past 13,000 years and have had profound, though as yet unrecognized, effects on the course of human history. And they draw attention in particular to the Torrid meteor stream, which we have just passed through. The Earth passes through the Torrid meteor stream twice a year, once at the end of June and again at the end of October and into early November. They're sometimes referred to as the Halloween fireworks. It's called the Torrid meteor stream because it appears to emanate from the region of the sky occupied by the constellation of Taurus. Of course, it's not coming from Taurus. It's in our solar system, but it looks like it comes from Taurus. And the Pleiades, of course, are part of the constellation of Taurus. And you have the November and the June, the Beta Taurids. Interesting how much emphasis there is in first American tradition on the Pleiades. Santa and I, just a couple of weeks ago, were up in Wyoming, and we went to see this place. These days it's called Devil's Tower. Be suspicious of any sacred monument of the past that has been renamed Devil's this or Devil's that, because that was the real devils trying to take over the old system of ideas and pollute it and corrupt it. But there's a very interesting story about this Bear Lodge Butte, as it should correctly be called. And the story is that one day, 7 young Indian maidens were out gathering in the woods when a huge bear charged towards them. And they saw a little mound of rock, and they ran to that mound of rock, and they got on top of it, and they prayed to the Creator to save them from the bear. And the Creator heard their prayer, and he raised that mound of rock up. And as he raised it up, the bear tried to climb it, and you can see the scratch marks of the bear's claws on the side of the rock. And the Creator kept raising the rock higher, and the bear kept trying to climb higher, until eventually the 7 maidens on the top of the rock were projected into the sky, and they became the 7 stars of the Pleiades. The Tunguska event, 30th of June, 1908, the height of the Beta Taurids. This was an object that fell out of the Torrid meteor stream. It wasn't a very big object. It might have been between 60 and 190 meters in diameter. It didn't even hit the Earth. It burst in the sky. When it burst in the sky, it did so, fortunately, over an uninhabited area of Siberia. Nobody was killed, but 80 million trees were laid flat across an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers, which is larger than Greater London. If that event had occurred over a major city, we would all be very concerned about the Torrid meteor stream today. So the Earth passes through it twice a year. This meteor stream is 30 million kilometers wide. It consists of different streams of debris. It includes 3 known comets, or comet-like objects, namely Comet Encke, Comet Olgiato, and Comet Rudnicki, and 19 of the brightest near-Earth objects. In other words, it contains huge objects in the range of 5 to 6 kilometers in diameter, as well as those small things that give us the nice shooting stars that we're not to worry about. So here's the math. The Earth travels 2.5 million miles a day on its orbital path. The Torrid meteor stream is 30 million kilometers wide, kilometers a day. The Torrid meteor stream is 30 million kilometers wide. That's why it takes us 12 days to pass through the Torrid meteor stream. I liken it to strapping on a blindfold twice a year and crossing an 8-lane interstate and just hoping that we don't meet any traffic. Or if we do, that it would be motorcycles rather than trucks. So while the astronomers have been looking at the sky, the team of scientists behind the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis have been looking at the ground and making disturbing new discoveries. And to cut a long story short, their conclusion is that the Torrid meteor stream is the remnant of a former giant comet, a comet that was more than 100 kilometers in diameter, and that 13,000 years ago, or rather 12,860 years ago to be exact, at least 4 large objects in the range of 1 to 2 kilometers in diameter fell out of the Torrid meteor stream and hit the North American ice cap. And Bill Napier's paper in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society is the first to formally link the findings of the 2 teams. These are the members of the Comet Research Group. They include James Kennett, who's a marine geologist, professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a world-renowned expert in paleoceanography. They include geophysicist Alan West, Richard Firestone, who's a staff scientist at the Nuclear Science Division, Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, James Whitkey, a geologist, and Albert Goodyear, who I was just with in South Carolina, a radical free-thinking archaeologist. In other words, these are not amateurs. These are all leading scientists, and they have come to their very grave conclusions after massive amounts of detailed work. And their conclusion is that a cataclysm struck the Earth 12,860 years ago, and that cataclysm was focused on North America, that North America was the epicenter. And we all know what happens to scientists when they propose that a cataclysm lies behind anything. They get attacked. And these guys have taken a lot of attacks, but they have kept on coming back. To understand the mystery that motivated their research, I need to remind you of the last glacial maximum, 21,300 years ago, those 3 kilometers deep ice caps, lower sea levels, freezing temperatures, and so on. But then suddenly, 12,800 years ago approximately, something really weird happens. After the last glacial maximum, the Earth started to warm up. And it was quite a nice gradualist warming. The Earth got warmer, the ice caps began to melt a little bit, but then 12,800 years ago, temperatures suddenly plummeted, and the Earth went back into a deep freeze as bad as it had been at the peak of the Ice Age. That deep freeze lasted for 1,200 years until 11,600 years ago, and then temperatures suddenly shot up. So it's this sudden freeze, 1,200 years of hostile freezing temperatures, and then this sudden rise of temperature that is the mystery. It's been recognized as a mystery for a long time. Geologists call the episode the Younger Dryas, after a certain species of alpine flower, but nobody could really say why it happened. What else happened 12,860 years ago was the extinction of the megafauna. No, the megafauna were not killed by bloodthirsty hunter-gatherers. the megafauna were killed by a cosmic cataclysm. And we see massive extinction events taking place both in North America and in South America, but indeed all over the world. And what do we find? At the Younger Dryas boundary, we find a layer in the soil, exactly like that layer in the soil left by the cosmic impact that destroyed the dinosaurs, filled with nanodiamonds and carbon spherules and melt glass and platinum and iridium. Impact proxies. There I am with Alan West at Murray Springs, and he's showing me the black mat layer, and he's pointing out that that black mat layer, as it's called, is actually wrapped like shrink wrap over the last remains of the Clovis culture. Indeed, at this site, the Clovis culture had hunted a mammoth, and they left some of their spear points in that mammoth, and then fire came down from the sky, and the black mat was laid down, and the Clovis culture was gone, and the megafauna were gone. At the same time, the Clovis culture did not wipe out the megafauna. Both the megafauna and the Clovis culture were wiped out by the same event. So I'm just going to I don't expect you to read these. I'm just going to quickly show you some of the papers. This is the first one, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, 2007. At that point, they thought the impact was 12,900 years ago. They brought it back 100 years since then. Evidence for an extraterrestrial impact 12,900 years ago that contributed to the megafaunal extinctions and the Younger Dryas cooling. Here's PNAS again, 2009, shock synthesized hexagonal diamonds in Younger Dryas boundary sediments. Here we have very high temperature impact melt products as evidence for cosmic airbursts and impacts 12,900 years ago. Evidence from Mexico, large platinum anomaly in the Greenland ice core, evidence for deposition of 10 million tons of impact spherules across 4 continents 12,800 years ago. Journal of Geology, 5th of September 2014, nanodiamond-rich layer across 3 continents consistent with major cosmic impact at 12,800 years before the present. I'm showing you these papers simply to make the point that this is not fringe science. These are all mainstream leaders in their field, but they have stuck their necks out and they have been punished by their colleagues for doing so. Finally, they've mapped out what they call the Younger Dryas boundary field. We can see that the epicenter was indeed in North America, but the same effects were felt on the northern European ice cap, and the furthest east evidence is actually in Syria at a site called Abu Huraira. This was truly a worldwide event. We need to imagine these bits of the comet coming in from the northwest and heading in a southeasterly direction, devastating North America and the final fallout from the comet as far east as Syria. Oh, and that Bayesian chronological analysis, that establishes that this didn't happen with a slow accumulation of material over hundreds of years. This happened in a single terrible day and night, 24-hour period. Well, of course, these are the papers that have attacked the Younger Dryas impact scientists. Here's one I particularly like. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a requiem. By some of their critics, I've written notes there somewhat premature, because this so-called requiem paper was published in 2011, and it has been utterly refuted. Those who still seek to discredit the Comet Research Group scientists often fail to comment that every one of the papers that has attacked them has been systematically refuted. And the general public are not made aware of this. It's a kind of ideological game that's going on. Even my friend and colleague Robert Schoch doesn't seem aware of the new research that has refuted the old criticisms. Here are some of the refutation papers that the team have published. And here I am with Chris Moore. This paper in Nature's Scientific Reports in March 2017 really settles it. They have found extraterrestrial platinum. I don't mean aliens by that. I mean platinum from an ET, from an asteroid or a comet. They have found ET platinum in all of the Younger Dryas boundary sites. And this is published in Nature, and there I am with Chris Moore at Johns Bay in the Carolinas, where some of this platinum evidence has been found. Nothing else can cause this except a comet impact, not in this abundance. What about the Carolina Bays themselves? They're not the best evidence for a cosmic impact. I'll tell you why, because you don't find impact proxies in the rims around the Carolina Bays. And you find a jumbling and mix-up of dates, so it doesn't look like they could all have been made overnight. But Antonio Zamora, in Geomorphology just this year, has published an interesting suggestion. He has pointed out that there's a typical Carolina Bay, pair of them for you. He has pointed out that they're not unique, that other similar formations are found more than 1,000 miles to the west, and those are the Nebraska rainwater basins. That's the Nebraska rainwater basins. That's LiDAR image of the Nebraska rainwater basins. You can see those elliptical bays. And the suggestion is that an impact on the Laurentide ice sheet, first of all, it explains why no crater has been found from the Younger Dryas impact, because the primary impacts were on ice that was 2 miles deep. When you get those primary impacts on ice, two things happen. A temporary crater is excavated in the ice, leaving very little evidence on the earth below. And secondly, ice boulders are ejected up into the upper atmosphere. Just a huge storm of ice is thrown into the upper atmosphere and comes back down. And Zamora's fascinating suggestion, which he's tested using the NASA Ames vertical gun, his fascinating suggestion is that the Carolina Bays and the Nebraska rainwater basin were caused by ejected ice, which came down on those two areas and left those elliptical depressions, and therefore did not contain the impact proxies that we would expect to find, and mixed up and mingled up all of the local context so that what is being dated is the terrain, not the impact itself. The thumb of Michigan. That's the NASA Ames vertical gun research. And I'll read Zamora's conclusion. The comet itself had not killed the megafauna. The saturation bombardment by the ice boulders that were ejected when the comet struck the Laurentide ice sheet caused the extinction event. The landscape of the eastern seaboard had been transformed into a barren wasteland full of huge, shallow mud holes. The Carolina Bays have remained as evidence of the glacier ice impacts on the soft, sandy soil of the East Coast. No such evidence remains of the ice chunks that must have fallen on harder ground, but the ice impacts in the central and midwestern states were equally merciless. When colossal chunks of glacier ice hit the hard terrain, they shattered and sent out ice fragments at high speed. Any creature or vegetation in the path of the fast-moving ice shards was destroyed. When the ice finally came to rest, the ejector blanket had covered 1/2 of the contiguous United States with a thick layer of crushed ice. That increased the albedo of the Earth and reflected a significant portion of the dimmer light from the sun back into space. The combined effect of the increased ice cover and the orbiting ice crystals would make the land cold and inhospitable for many years. The buried vegetation would freeze or remain dormant under the ice. Grazing animals that had survived the glacier ice bombardment had no access to their normal food sources and would soon starve. Eventually, North America would be repopulated by new animals and new humans, but the megafauna and the ingenious Clovis people that had crafted such fine stone projectiles were gone forever. And yes, the critics have said there's an absence of craters. I've explained why, because the primary craters were excavated in 2-mile deep ice, but the team are finding craters now at the edges of the ice cap, the Coruscant crater, the Bloody Creek structure, the Charity Shoal feature, and so on and so forth. St. Croix River, Minnesota, the Finger Lakes of New York State, the Coulees and Channel Scablands, and so on and so forth. This 15-ton Willamette meteorite is now in the Natural History Museum of New York. It fell on the North American ice cap and was transported in an iceberg to the Willamette Valley, Oregon, during the cataclysmic Younger Dryas floods 12,800 years ago. The Clackamanus tribe called it Tamamawas before it was seized by the Oregon Iron and Steel Company. According to tribal legend, Tamanawas was sent to Earth as a representative of the Sky People, exemplifying a union of sky, earth, and water. So I would say, despite the toxic hostility of their gradualist colleagues, it's increasingly clear that the Comet Research Group scientists are right, that they're onto something of immense importance, and that their Younger Dryas impact hypothesis will be vindicated, changing everything about how we view our past. In summary, 12,800 years ago, multiple fragments of a giant comet impacted the Earth. At least 4 of the fragments were objects in the range of 2 kilometers in diameter. Impacts were concentrated on the North American ice cap, but the resulting climate disaster was worldwide. So, the onset is 12,860 years ago. Why did the Earth suddenly get so cold? We have the answer to that now. What happened 12,800 years ago was that the Gulf Stream was interrupted. It was stopped dead in its tracks. And the Gulf Stream is part of the global thermohaline circulation. It's the central heating system of our planet. What could it take to stop it? How come it stopped and allowed temperatures to fall? The only explanation that makes sense, because this was the beginning of a deep freeze. If this was the beginning of a period when the ice sheets were melting down all over the place, you could get it. But 12,860 years ago was the beginning of 1,200 years of freezing temperatures. The only thing that makes sense is that an enormous amount of meltwater was released by the heat of that comet impact, causing the damage on the Channel Scablands, but also sending floods of icy meltwater into the Atlantic Ocean, interrupting the Gulf Stream. And almost equally mysterious, the sudden rise in temperatures 11,600 years ago, which truly was the end of the Ice Age. That's when the ice sheets really melted down. And scientists are already recognizing that an earlier warming period was caused by a comet impact. And back in the 1980s, Sir Fred Hoyle, professor of astronomy at Cambridge University, was intrigued by that sudden rise of temperatures, the meltdown of the ice caps 11,600 years ago. And presciently, he proposed that that might have been caused by a comet impact, not a comet impact on ice, like the comet impact that started the Younger Dryas, but a comet impact in a world ocean, which sent up a huge flood and cloud of water vapor into the upper atmosphere, creating a greenhouse effect and resulting in the warming that led to the end of the Ice Age. I'm interested in Robert Schoch's theory too, that it was to do that sudden global warming may have been to do with a massive increase of solar activity. The science on the end of the Younger Dryas is not nearly as advanced as the science on the beginning. It's still a mystery why the Younger Dryas ended and why the world warmed up so fast. And I think we have to be open to any and every possibility. But whatever the agency, what is certain is that the Younger Dryas did end abruptly 11,600 years ago. Global temperatures soared and the remaining ice caps very rapidly collapsed into the sea, causing a dramatic pulse of sea level rise nominated by geologists as Meltwater Pulse 1b. Meltwater Pulse 1b is dated to 11,600 years ago. Oddly enough, 11,600 years ago is exactly the date that Plato gives us for the destruction and submergence of the lost civilization of Atlantis. Plato tells us a number of things about Atlantis. By the way, he's the earliest surviving source. He tells us that the characteristics of Atlantis included advanced architecture, advanced agriculture, advanced navigational shipbuilding and seagoing skills, advanced social and political organization. And he tells us that Atlantis was formerly a beautiful and generous culture dedicated to the nature of spirit, but that as time went by, it became arrogant and cruel and materialistic. And in a rigging phrase, he tells us that Atlantis ceased to carry its prosperity with moderation. And he suggests that for this hubris of Atlantis, this overweening pride, this arrogance, this greed of Atlantis, that the universe slapped Atlantis down. And we learn that in a single dreadful day and night, Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea and vanished, and mankind had to begin again like children with no memory of what went before. How do we know that it happened 11,600 years ago? Again, Plato is very clear. If we study the Timaeus and Critias, what we find is that Solon, a famous Greek lawmaker, an ancestor of Plato's, visited Egypt in 600 BC, approximately. And there at the Temple of Sais in the Delta, he was told the story of Atlantis by Egyptian priests. And when he asked them, when was Atlantis swallowed up by the sea and vanished? And the priests replied, 9,000 years ago. 9,000 years ago in 600 BC allows us to put quite a precise date on the submergence of Atlantis. In our calendar, it's 9,600 BC. In other words, 11,600, or if you like, 11,617 years ago. So if Plato made the whole story up, he was astonishingly on the money with the latest geology of Meltwater Pulse 1b. In my view, this cannot be a coincidence. We know that there was giant flooding 11,600 years ago. We have this powerful story from Plato of a lost civilization destroyed in flooding 11,600 years ago. How much effort does it really take to put those two pieces together? Of course, Egyptologists will tell you that there is no mention. There's no mention of Atlantis in any ancient Egyptian text. And that is strictly speaking true. You will not find the word Atlantis in any ancient Egyptian text. But will you find a story of a sacred island of the gods that was home to an advanced culture that was flooded and drowned beneath the sea in an overnight disaster? And the answer is yes, you will. And you will find that story on the walls, carved into the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt. This temple is not particularly old. It's a Ptolemaic temple. Dates to about 300 BC. But it was built on the site of an older temple that had fallen to pieces, which it turns out was built on the site of an even older temple that had also fallen to pieces, which, guess what, was built on the site of an even older temple that had also fallen to pieces. And you can keep regressing it back into the pre-dynastic period. And this temple inherited the archives of the previous temples. And those archives included materials written on animal skins that were falling apart. And the priests decided it was their responsibility to preserve them. So they carved them, extracts from them, deeply into the walls of this temple between the inner and outer enclosure walls, and they are called the Edfu building texts. And this is what they look like. And broadly speaking, they tell this story. They tell of a homeland of the primeval ones. It was an island. It was destroyed in a great flood. And they tell how the primeval ones, the survivors of that flood, came to Egypt as the gods and established religion by building primeval mounds up and down the land. Those primeval mounds were a kind of blueprint. They were to be the site of all future temples and pyramids that would ever be built in Egypt at any period of history. And we hear of a snake called the Great Leaping One, whose assault causes the homeland of the primeval ones to be swallowed up by the sea. But first the island was pierced and the domain was split. In many cultures, comets are referred to as serpents or snakes. The Edfu texts speak of survivors of the destruction of the primeval island of the gods, of their wanderings afterwards, and of their project to reconstitute or resurrect their lost former world. And this project was pursued not only in Egypt, but in many other lands as well. For example, Turkey. That date, 11,600 years ago, isn't only the date that Plato gives us for the submergence and destruction of Atlantis. It's also the date that the German Archaeological Institute gives us for the invention of megalithic architecture and agriculture at a site called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. The same date, 11,600 years ago. And this is Stonehenge here, and this is Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. It is not supposed to exist. Big megalithic sites like this, according to prevailing archaeological dogma, are supposed to be the work of Neolithic cultures, settled cultures that have developed agriculture, that generate surpluses that allow some people to work as architects, some as engineers, others to farm. They can specialize their skills, and then they can create something like Stonehenge. But the trouble is that the entire culture around Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, 7,000 years before Stonehenge, were not agriculturalists. They were hunter-gatherers, and yet they suddenly created this huge megalithic site. In fact, the largest megalithic site on Earth. There it is with these distinct T-shaped megaliths. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. And they're on a more than human scale. And some of them have just incredible carvings and imagery carved in high relief on the side of the megaliths. And here I am with the late Klaus Schmidt, the leader of the German Archaeological Institute expedition to Göbekli Tepe. Sadly, Klaus Schmidt passed away in 2014. I had this meeting with him in 2013. Well, you know, when I first went to Göbekli Tepe, I was slightly worried because I'm a little bit of a notorious figure amongst archaeologists. And usually what archaeologists do when they see me turn up on a site is they turn their backs and walk away. Sometimes they make the sign of the cross, you know, a vampire has appeared. But Klaus was lovely. He knew who I was. He welcomed me to the site. He said, let me show you around. And he gave me 3 days of his precious time to really show me that site. And what he's pointing out to me here are two things. Firstly, he's pointing vehemently at the ground. Why? Because ground-penetrating radar has demonstrated that so far they have only excavated 1/50th of the total site. 50 times as much still lies beneath the ground, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of giant pillars. And secondly, this stuff in the background here, this is not natural sediment. All of these pillars were deliberately buried in a single operation that must have unfolded over a period of weeks. You have to envisage teams of people with buckets full of soil and rubble, pouring them into the pits and the trenches where the megaliths stood, and filling them up and covering them up and covering them up, and finally raising a hill over the top of them. Because that's what Göbekli Tepe means in the Turkish language. It means pot-bellied hill. For some reason, after running for 1,000 years, this site was deliberately shut down and decommissioned. At exactly the same time that the site was established, agriculture magically appears in Turkey. Those hunter-gatherers overnight become agriculturalists. They demonstrate new skills that they had never demonstrated before. Klaus Schmidt put it that Göbekli Tepe must have been a center of innovation. I think that rather than a sudden, mysteriously precocious invention 7,000 years ahead of its time, what Göbekli Tepe looks more like is a transfer of technology from the survivors of a lost civilization who already knew how to work megaliths on a grand scale and who already fully understood agriculture. And actually, it's not alone. This is Karahan Tepe, 50 miles away. It's another Göbekli Tepe type site in a farmer's backyard, hasn't even been excavated yet. Interestingly enough, Göbekli Tepe lies between the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia means between two rivers. That's those two rivers. Can we separate Göbekli Tepe off from the later culture of Mesopotamia, of Sumer and Babylon and so on and so forth? I don't think so. Particularly so since an early Sumerian tablet, do you see these T-shaped megaliths here? An early Sumerian tablet shows a site like Göbekli Tepe. So we have to pay attention to the traditions of Mesopotamia concerning the Great Flood and how civilization was brought to that region by a creature who sometimes is described as part fish and part man. He was called Oannes. And with him were 7 Apkallu, the 7 sages of Mesopotamia. Interestingly, as well as wearing fishes on their heads, all of these 7 sages carry these cute little man bags. Very distinctive. And the funny thing is that the exact same man bag turns up on the earliest image of Quetzalcoatl in Central America. This is from the Olmec site of La Venta. It's a plumed serpent encircling this individual, and what he's holding here is the same man bag that we see on the Oannes figures, the 7 sages from Mesopotamia. And you see this pillar at Göbekli Tepe? I showed you a picture of it earlier. We get up closer and we can see that those man bags are on that pillar as well. But in that case, we know they're 11,600 years old. Are they the symbol of some kind of brotherhood, some kind of a group of initiates who went around the world seeking to reconstitute the world that had been lost, seeking to bring back the civilization that the cataclysm had destroyed. I'm going to be going on for about another half hour. I hope that's okay. Okay. Because amongst the devices carved on the Göbekli Tepe pillars are the disk and the crescent, 11,600 years ago. And that exact same disk and crescent were also found at the Temple of the Moon at a city called Haran, quite near to Göbekli Tepe, which was the home of a people called the Sabians. Now, the Sabians used to make a pilgrimage from Haran to Giza in Egypt. And they made that pilgrimage from time immemorial to as late as the 12th century AD. The Arab geographer Yaqut al-Hamawi gives the dimensions of the two largest of the Giza pyramids in his geographical dictionary and adds to both of them, the Sabians made their pilgrimage. And Egyptologist Salim Hassan worked in the 1930s, far ahead of any of his modern colleagues, points out, now, of course, these Sabians were star worshippers. And if I guess rightly, they had derived their name from the Egyptian word Sabah, star. The Sabians were the followers of an ancient religion, worshippers of the hosts of heaven, the heavenly bodies. Whatever the origin of their name may have been, the fact remains that they fully recognized the pyramids as being monuments connected with the stellar cult and revered them as places of pilgrimage. So here is the Giza Plateau, the wonderful marriage of heaven and earth that takes place there. And here is the Great Pyramid. Whatever else the Great Pyramid is doing, the Great Pyramid is certainly speaking to the planet on which we live. The Great Pyramid stands at a significant latitude 30 degrees north. That is 1/3 of the way between the equator and the North Pole. That is not a random latitude. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north, the rotation axis of the Earth, with such precision that the error is only 3/60ths of a single degree. It's very, very closely tied in to our planet. And something else, if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by 43,200, which is not a random number, and I'll explain why, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you measure the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply that by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. Egyptologists know this, but they say it's a coincidence. Has to be a coincidence as far as they're concerned, because how could the ancient Egyptians have possibly known the dimensions of the Earth, let alone create a 1 to 43,200 scale model? But it's precisely that scale that proves the Egyptologists wrong. Because there is a phenomenon called the precession, it's modeled on this GIF here, a wobble on the axis of the Earth. It's why our pole star will not always be Polaris and has not always been Polaris. It's why we have the zodiacal constellations marching behind the sun, each house trading places with the next on the equinoctial sunrise once every 2,160 years. We've been in the age of Pisces for just over the last 2,000 years. Why? Because if you look due east at dawn on the spring equinox, you will see the constellation of Pisces lying in the place where the sun will rise. But the sun is moving out of Pisces, and we do indeed live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. This whole process operates at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. That is the heartbeat of the cycle. 1 degree every 72 years. So you get a complete house of the zodiac in 2,160 years, and 360 degrees the great year in 25,920 years. If you want chapter and verse on this, go read Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana, professor of history of science at MIT, and Hertha von Deschend. I had to read it 5 times and make detailed notes before I got it, but it's an astonishing piece of work. And what it documents is ancient worldwide knowledge of precession of the equinoxes encoded in myth. And this information encoded in these ancient myths goes back thousands of years before the Greek astronomers who are supposed to have discovered precession. And you find it in these number systems that are found in mythology all around the world. And Santillana and von Deschen trace the origin of the system to some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization of prehistoric antiquity that first dared to understand the world as created according to number, measure, and weight. And this is why the scale of 1 to 43,200 is important, because it is generated by the precession of the equinox. It's a multiple of 72. It's 72 times 600. In other words, they have given us the dimensions of our planet on a scale defined by a key motion of the planet itself. And that cannot be an accident. That cannot be a coincidence. That is planning. That is design. That is science. The system is not only expressed in myth, but also in architecture. For example, the avenues of statues at Angkor in Cambodia, 108 in each avenue, 54 on each side. Why 108? Why 54? 72 degrees is the heartbeat of the cycle. Half of 72 is 36. Add 36 to 72, you get 108. Divide 108 by 2, you get 54. These are all precessional numbers that occur again and again in myths and traditions all around the world. Could such a system, using astronomy and megalithic architecture, have been deployed to spell out the finding epoch of what is arguably the most renowned archaeological site in the world, the Giza Plateau in Egypt with the Great Pyramids and the Great Sphinx? Mainstream Egyptology says these monuments are exclusively the work of the 4th dynasty, roughly 2,500 BC or 4,500 years ago. But the astronomy of the monuments suggests a much more complex and nuanced picture. We cannot separate the Great Pyramid entirely from the ancient Egyptians. To do so would be utterly foolish, whimsical, and frankly stupid. The ancient Egyptians were the inheritors of a much older system. They honored and venerated those who had come in the first time, and they sought to manifest and represent their works on earth. This is the so-called King's Chamber, and into its walls are cut these, that you can see one of the shafts just there on the right. One shaft goes north and one shaft goes south, and they both target stars, key stars, one in Orion's belt, one in the circumpolar stars, at the epoch of 2,500 BC. It's the same with the shafts in the Queen's Chamber. The southern shaft targets Sirius, the northern shaft targets the circumpolar stars, again in 2,500 BC. So there is a connection of these pyramids to 2,500 BC, no doubt about it. But what if we look at the layout of the pyramids on the ground? This is the Nile Valley, and here are the 3 great pyramids of Giza, and the Great Sphinx is down there. There's the Great Sphinx looking eternally to the east. If you get up illegally on the back of the Sphinx, oh, I've just dropped my microphone, have I? Can I have some help with my, is it still working? Okay, it's fallen off my head, but never mind. If you get up illegally on the Sphinx's back on the summer solstice, you're going to see the sun rising way over here, far to the north of east. Should you be up there on the winter solstice, the sun will be over here, far to the south of east. But if you get up illegally on the Sphinx's back on the spring equinox, the 21st of March, you will see the sun rising in direct alignment with the gaze of the Sphinx. That is because the Sphinx is an equinoctial marker. It is designed to marry heaven and earth at dawn on the equinox. So the question is, what constellation was lying behind the sun when the Sphinx was made? What age was it? If the Sphinx was made in 2500 BC, that was the age of Taurus. The ancient Egyptians, whatever else they were not astronomically illiterate. If they were going to build an equinoctial marker in the age of Taurus, they would have built it in the form of a bull. But they built it in the form of a lion. How can we explain that? Was there a time when the lion constellation rose with the sun on the spring equinox? And the answer is that there was, and that was the age of Leo. And it lay roughly, almost exactly actually, over the Younger Dryas, between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. A sphinx in the sky and a sphinx on the ground. We think originally the sphinx was entirely a lion-bodied monument, and that in ancient Egyptian times its head, very eroded, was recarved into the pharaoh's head that it has today. So there's our three great pyramids. And here is my great friend and colleague, Robert Bauval, the originator of the Orion correlation. It was Robert who first noticed the astonishing similarity between the pattern of the three great pyramids on the ground and the pattern of the three stars of Orion's belt. And Robert and I, working together on the message of the Sphinx, came to the next conclusion. Once you take the skies back to 12,800 years ago, the constellation of Leo houses the sun. An hour later, as the sun divides the horizon, the constellation of Orion is lying due south on the meridian in exactly the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground. And we would say that what confronts us at Giza is a three-dimensional representation of the equinoctial sky as it would have looked throughout the epoch from 12,800 years ago to 11,600 years ago. An epoch that we now know to have been marked by dramatic cataclysms and earth changes on a scale that must have affected humanity profoundly. And as a matter of fact, if that seems like a strange idea, we did it at the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam includes a map of the sky. They froze the sky above the Hoover Dam, and Oscar Hansen, the artist responsible for that star map, believed, quote, that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. I mean, who gives a damn about when the Hoover Dam was built? But my point is that if you want to send information to the future, don't entrust it to a written document, because they might not speak your language 10,000 years from now, or that document might not survive. Entrust it to a universal language that any astronomically literate society can decode, and entrust it to giant megalithic monuments that will stand the test of time, and then your message will be passed on. So Robert and I believe very much that the subterranean chamber of the Great Pyramid is part of the original work that was done at Giza 12,800 years ago. And that the Great Sphinx is part of that work too. And here's John Anthony West, great man, great friend of mine. Very happy to say we were able to visit John Anthony West in upstate New York just 2 weeks ago. He was diagnosed with terminal stage 4 lung cancer in January this year. He refused chemo. He refused radiotherapy. We managed to raise crowdfunding for him. He went to the Brzezinski Clinic, entirely alternative methods of treatment. He is now 97% cancer-free. And he is back home. We visited him in his home in Saugerties, New York. He's still in bed. He's still a little bit weak, but he's full of vim and vigor and full of ideas and full of fight to take the fight back to the Egyptologists. It was John Anthony West who first brought Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University, geologist Robert Schoch, to Giza in 1992. And Schoch quickly confirmed what West had suspected, that the Great Sphinx had been subjected at some period of its career to more than 1,000 years of heavy rainfall. And you do not get heavy rainfall in Egypt in the last 5,000 years. You have to go back to the Younger Dryas, 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, to get those heavy rains that could have created this kind of erosion patterns on the Sphinx. And of course, the dreadful Zahi Hawass and his American colleague, Mark Lehner, poo-pooed this whole idea in 1992 at the Geological Society of America. And they said it's absolute rubbish. West and Schoch are talking nonsense. We know that the Sphinx is only 4,500 years old. They said, why? If there was a culture in the world that was capable of creating the Sphinx 12,000 years ago, then we would find many other monuments like it. And there are no other such monuments. Well, they could get away with such nonsense in 1992, but they can't get away with it in 2017, not since we found Göbekli Tepe, which dates from that same period. And if you can make Göbekli Tepe, then you can make the Sphinx. I think we're looking at the fingerprints of a lost civilization. Let's return briefly to those Sabians of Haran and their mysterious pilgrimage to Giza. It turns out that the Sabians were great astronomers, great mathematicians. They developed trigonometry, and they used in particular right triangles, 3, 4, 5 right triangles. That's a triangle that has its side lengths in the dimensions 3, 4, and 5. It has a 90-degree angle. It has a 53.13-degree angle, and it has the acute angle of 36.87 degrees. That is the distinguishing mark of a 3, 4, 5 right triangle, used by the Sabians of Haran, by men like Thabit ibn Qurra, who I'm quoting here. Again, we'll go back to this model of the Earth's circumference on a scale of 1 to 43,200. And let's go to the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid. And lo and behold, it turns out that there's a right triangle inside the king's chamber with those same angles, 36.87 degrees for the acute angle. And that's how the right triangle works out. And here's the astonishing thing, which anthropologist and archaeologist James Hugh Jacobs was the first to notice. Something really stunning and extraordinary about Haran, from whence the Sabians made their annual pilgrimage to Giza. Haran stands at latitude 36.87 degrees north. This is a culture that used right triangles in its trigonometry, that used that angle again and again. It can't be a coincidence that its latitude is 36.87 degrees north. It must have been deliberately sited at that latitude. So the question is when? As J.Q. Jacobs points out, even non-archaeos understand stratification and deposition basics. Deeper is older. Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. Haran is equated with Ur of Sumeria, the civilized land and a cradle of civilization. That cradle in astronomy is presumed to be 4,000 to 5,000 years old, not 12,000. But Haran is located at 3/4 Atan latitude, a fixed parameter. And here's the amazing thing. Göbekli Tepe is at a specific latitude difference north. Because the fixed parameter must come first, the conundrum, of course, is that this precise 1/1000th of circumference latitude difference is either a coincidence or ancient astronomy just took a leap back to 12,000 years ago. And I think it does. And what Göbekli Tepe does is it begins to make sense of other sites around the world that are now being found. And it causes us to question archaeological sites that have been dated 3,000 or 4,000 years old, but look just like Göbekli Tepe and may in fact be much older. Like the temples of Malta. I believe that the Maltese temples are far older than the 5,000 years or so given to them by archaeology. Göbekli Tepe is going to require a complete reevaluation of all of this. And I think what we're looking at is indeed the work of a brotherhood that went around the world seeking to spread and restart civilization. Back to Tiwanaku. This is the so-called Semi Subterranean Temple, which stands just in front of the Colosseum. And you can see that there's some figures in the middle of the Semi Subterranean Temple. One of those figures is this one. It's a pillar. It's got a serpent carved up its side. And on the front of it, there's this face. And that face is luxuriantly bearded, a heavily bearded face, just like the bearded face of other civilizing figures from around the world. And it's associated with the civilization bringer Viracocha, who came in a time of darkness after a great flood. The question is, when did he come? Up on the side of this pillar is carved this little animal. We've turned it on its side and highlighted it here. It does not look like any known species of animal in the Andes today, but it's astonishingly like Toxodon, which is one of the megafauna that became extinct during the Younger Dryas cataclysm sometime after 12,800 years ago. Is it possible that the Viracocha myth goes back that far? That we're again looking at here in the so-called New World at these same figures who traveled the world spreading civilization. Viracocha's travels took him to Manta in Ecuador, from where he crossed the Pacific Ocean walking on water. Interestingly, the remnants of pillars have been found deep beneath the Pacific Ocean. And then we come to Easter Island. And of course, Easter Island is famous for its moai, these huge statues, many of which are erected upon platforms called ahu. Now, you cannot directly date a stone structure. So when archaeologists tell us that the moai of Easter Island are between 700 and 1,000 years old, what are they basing that on? Why? They have to be basing it on context. They have to be basing it on organic material. Where did they get the organic material from? They got it from these platforms. Found some organic material, carbon dated it to 700 to 1,000 years old, and concluded that the statues are therefore 700 to 1,000 years old as well. But let's have a closer look at that platform. When we do so, we find that built into it is a ruined and ancient Easter Island head. And that alone tells us that the statues are much older than the wall. And whoever made this wall actually recycled fragments of a statue. Maybe it was a completely other culture that came by later on and re-erected some of these moai on these walls, and archaeologists are mistakenly dating the moai to the organic material in the walls. If you go to the Ranararaku quarry, it's a surreal experience. You can see 200 of these heads sticking up out of the ground. And you might be forgiven for thinking that they just go down, a few feet under the ground. But Thor Heyerdahl gave the lie to that in his excavations at Easter Island in the 50s and again in the 80s. Actually, these statues go down 30 feet under the ground. And that is all natural sedimentation. Frank Joseph in 2006 was the first person to point out that you cannot get 30 feet of sedimentation on a tiny island like Easter Island in just a few hundred years. And Robert Schoch has been over there and done more detailed work, and he reckons that it took thousands and thousands of years for that sedimentation to build up. I had the privilege of knowing Thor Heyerdahl. He was a great believer in Atlantis, and I wish he'd lived to know about Göbekli Tepe, because if he had, he would have been intrigued by the similar iconography. See, those Göbekli Tepe pillars, they actually have arms and hands. And those hands meet in front of the belly, just like the hands of the Easter Island figures. And they have belts, just like the Easter Island figures as well. And those belts have this curious H-shaped logo on them, just as we find at Tiwanaku. All of this would have intrigued Thor enormously if he'd had the opportunity to be aware of it. And not only that, those Easter Island heads, those are not just men with giant chins. Those are bearded men. You can see the beards quite clearly, and tradition is that civilization was brought to Easter Island in remote antiquity by 7 initiated men, 7 sages, if you like, who arrived by boat from the lost land of Hiva and who established and laid out the island's future sacred landscape. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, civilization bringer to ancient Mexico. And again, this imagery of these bearded figures is found all over certain parts of Mexico. Osiris, the bringer of the gifts of civilization, he was said to have reigned in the remote past in the epoch that the ancient Egyptians called Zep Tepi, the first time. So the standard response of historians and archaeologists is to scoff at any suggestion of a lost civilization of the Ice Age and to smear those willing to contemplate this possibility as frauds or fantasists or cranks or worse. We're told that the house of history is solidly built and that there's just no room or need for anything even remotely like Atlantis. But we all know what happens to houses that are built on foundations of sand. And the problem with this mainstream view is that historians and archaeologists have not yet factored the implications of the Younger Dryas cataclysm into their model and into the timeline of the origins of civilization, because that cataclysm takes place right at the break between the so-called Mesolithic and the Neolithic, 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. And they're just not taking account of it at all, because their ideology says, we don't like catastrophes. We want everything to happen gradually. And something else in America is the deliberate ruin and destruction of Native American culture and of its past and of its heritage, the deliberate wiping out of Native American culture. This is Paulette Steeves at the University of Massachusetts. She's Cree Metis, first PhD candidate in her field, successfully to defend her dissertation using indigenous method and theory. And she spent years building a database of Pleistocene archaeological sites that show her ancestors have been in the Americas far longer than previously acknowledged. The history of indigenous people in the Americas was manufactured, says Steeves, to make it easier to overlook the atrocities that colonization brought. When people started coming here to the Americas, they were finding signs of great civilizations, and stories were created to say these sites and this civilization was not built by the indigenous people. They called them savages. They created the people here as nature, not as culture. If it's a culture, you can't massacre them or kill them or put a head price on them. But if they're nature, it's okay to do that. And Steeves is now realizing that human beings have been in the Americas for more than 100,000 years. So the very real possibility emerging from the Comet Research Works group that a huge earth-shaking extinction level event occurred over North America just 12,800 years ago helps to make sense of the archaeological chaos, confusion, competing narratives, and DNA mysteries that now dominate the debate around the peopling of the Americas. So much more than Clovis was wiped away and obliterated in North America during the Younger Dryas cataclysm that, who knows, perhaps even the fingerprints of a lost advanced global civilization await discovery right here in North America. I certainly think that's the case. And back to Plato and telling us how mankind had to begin again like children and how it was really only the hunter-gatherers in the hills and mountains who survived the disaster that submerged Atlantis. This cataclysm really raises legitimate doubts over everything we've been taught about the origins of civilization. To Plato's story of lost Atlantis, an advanced global civilization of the Ice Age destroyed completely 11,600 years ago. Plato makes a point of telling us that the cataclysm spared only shepherds, destitute of letters and education, while the great cities of the Atlantean Empire and their civilized literate inhabitants were swallowed up by the sea. And as a result, mankind had to begin again like children with no memory of what went before. I'm going to end within 5 minutes, I promise. If there is no doubt about the origins of civilization, if there is doubt about the origins of civilization, there's also doubt about its future. NASA's reassuring figure of 100 million year intervals between extinction level events is complacent and irresponsible. NASA says that none of the asteroids or comets identified will come close to impacting the Earth in the next 100 years. But the problem is that actually NASA has no idea how many comets and asteroids are out there. So the database is utterly worthless. And it's the unidentified and unknown objects that really should concern us. And scientists estimate that so far, only 1% of potentially hazardous asteroids have been identified, with 99%, more than 100,000, still awaiting discovery. Is the universe trying to send us a wake-up call? We keep getting these flybys of previously unidentified asteroids, some of them passing between the Earth and the Moon. 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. Oh yeah, February 2017, March 2017. I stopped in April 2017, but there's been many more since then. None of these had been identified by NASA before they whizzed past the Earth. It is not safe to say that we are safe for the next 35 million years. And more scientists are beginning to realize this. And they are identifying the Torrid meteor stream as the place that we should really be keeping our eyes on. Victor Klub, Dr. Emilio Spedicato, a mathematician at the University of Bergamo, Dr. Bill Napier, their research and calculations indicate that in addition to the known Torrid objects, for example, Encke, Olgiato, and Rudniki, all in the range of 2 to 5 kilometers in diameter, there are also, quote, between 1 and 200 asteroids of more than a kilometer in diameter orbiting within the Torrid meteor stream. Amongst them, these scientists believe it is at least one very large and as yet undetected object estimated to be 30 kilometers in diameter the largest fragment of the original giant comet that makes up the stream. This unique complex of debris, they write, is undoubtedly the greatest collision hazard facing the Earth at the present time. And as Newsweek rightly says, asteroids can be stopped, but somebody has to pay. This is not a story of gloom and doom. We have the technology now to sweep our cosmic environment clean. But what are we doing with our technology? Where do the trillions and the billions of dollars go? They go into creating weapons of mass destruction so that we can have ever more sophisticated ways to murder our fellow human beings. They do not go into investments to protect the Earth, into saving the rainforests, and into sweeping the skies clean of asteroids that can stop civilization in its track and end our story right here and now. The technology exists to do it now, but the will does not exist. We'll spend the money endlessly on the military, but we will not spend it on protecting this gorgeous, beautiful garden of a planet that the universe has bestowed upon us. NASA photograph of the Earth from the sky, often taken as a sign of shows the so-called advanced, technologically advanced cultures. So you can see that Northern Europe is lit up like a string of jewels, but Africa is largely dark. That's because Northern Europe's technologically advanced and Africa is less electrified. Only if you live in one of these cities, you can't even see the sky because of light pollution. But when you look down on the Earth from above, that's what you see. And if we go over to the other hemisphere, we can see North America and Northern Europe glowing like jewels, but the Amazon basin is dark. Who lives in the Amazon basin? Hunter-gatherers. Some of those hunter-gatherers are so remote that they've not even yet had contact with our culture. They might look up in the sky one day and see an airplane flying over. And they think, what the hell is that? You know? But if the Earth were to be struck again in the way that it was 12,800 years ago, who would survive? It would not be us. It would not be our advanced technological civilization. I believe our advanced technological civilization would fall apart in shock and trauma within weeks. We do not have the survival skills. We do not know how to live off the land. We depend on a complex, interrelated network of specialities. It would be the hunter-gatherers of the Earth, the meek of the Earth, who have those skills, who would carry the human story forward into the future. And who's to say, 12,000 years from now, that their descendants might not be telling a story about a time, you know, the archaeologists of that period would probably call it a myth. They would tell a story about a time when a great advanced civilization lived on this planet. They were so advanced, they could even send men to the moon. They could fly around the Earth. They could speak to one another on opposite sides of the planet. They had almost godlike powers, but they became cruel. They became arrogant. They became greedy. They became materialistic. All they cared about was what they could produce and what they could consume and the material goods they could accumulate. They ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation, and the universe struck them down. It's not too late. Let's make sure we are not the next lost civilization. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you.
Standing ovation, please. Incredible message. What Graham Hancock is offering, the world needs to hear. Thank you, Graham Hancock.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Feeling grateful for all the love, grateful to be amongst so many open-minded, free-thinking people. And thank you to Tim and Anne for organizing this fantastic event. These are two of the greatest people in the world. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to keep you all so long. Sweet. Thank you.
schöne. Sondern lasst uns angenehmere anstimmen und freudenvollere. Freude, schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium. Wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng gedet. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weit. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng gedet. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weit. Freund zu sein, wir ein heutes Weiberungen, ich schön meine Tochter aus Elysium.